Everyone knows about the Great Flood, about Noah and the wooden ark amidst 40 days and nights of relentless rain. Everyone has heard of Goliath, the giant felled by a shepherd boy. But have you ever wondered, why did such monumental events happen at that exact moment, not sooner, not later? Why did God wait? Why didn't he intervene the moment sin began to spread? The answer lies in a book long left behind, an ancient text removed from most Western versions of the Bible. Yet it has been preserved through the centuries in the caves of Qumran, in ancient rituals, in the silent memory of a people, the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees tells us that God not only created mankind, but also created time, not time as we know it. Days passing, ticking hours, but a sacred rhythm, a Jubilee cycle. Each cycle is 49 years, and within each cycle, great events were preordained. The births of the patriarchs, the fall of the angels, the emergence of the Nephilim, the flood, the covenant ceremony, wars and restoration. Nothing is random, nothing happens by chance. God does not act impulsively, he acts at the appointed time. Whether in judgment or redemption, everything follows a divine clock, visible only to a chosen few. And if that is true, another question rings clear, like a bell in the night. Where are we now in that cycle? If the Nephilim have returned in more cunning forms, if the world is once again filled with violence and chaos, if morality is distorted once more, if nature is groaning with upheaval, then perhaps we are not merely living through events, but approaching a moment that was written long ago, a point marked in advance, found in a book the world chose to forget. The question is no longer, what happened? But rather, what is about to happen? And are you reading the clock correctly? If you live by the solar calendar, you are not wrong. But perhaps you are misaligned, not by minutes, but by an entire sacred rhythm God established from the beginning. The Book of Jubilees calls it God's calendar, a system not governed by the physical seasons, but by a 364-day recurring rhythm divided into sacred cycles of 49 years, each called a Jubilee. Unlike human calendars, ever-changing with politics, astronomy, or culture, the sacred calendar does not drift by a single day. And in that calendar, every major event in human history happens precisely on schedule. Jubilees tells us the angels were sent to earth at the 10th Jubilee cycle, when the descendants of Adam began to stray from the covenant. The fall of the Watchers didn't happen by accident, but at the very moment humanity's moral fabric began to unravel. The punishment by water, the Great Flood, was withheld by God for hundreds of years because the appointed time recorded in the sacred calendar had not yet come. The birth of Abraham, the man who would keep the covenant in a lost world, was marked as the beginning of a new cycle of restoration. In the world of Jubilees, everything has a designated time. Not because God is bound by time, but because he created time as a sacred structure for mankind to walk in sync with the covenant. When people live rightly, they align with the sacred calendar. When they stray, they fall into the dark gaps between cycles where blindness, violence, and chaos rule. Strangely, the Book of Jubilees also warns, a time will come when mankind will abandon the 364-day calendar and replace it with a distorted 365-day system or a mixed sun-moon model. From that point, the holy days would be forgotten. The offerings would be made at the wrong times. The covenant would fade, not because God changed, but because mankind no longer moved in step with him. So, if today's world is slipping into crisis, perhaps it's not because God has withdrawn, but because man has forgotten heaven's clock. And you, even as you count the days like everyone else, are you truly living in God's time? Or are you straying day by day from a sacred rhythm older than Genesis? We often see Eden as a brief opening chapter, a fairy tale prelude to the Bible. And we view Sinai as the beginning of a nation with laws and a covenant. But Jubilees doesn't divide history this way. It connects Eden and Sinai with a red thread, not a thread of time, but the bloodline of a spiritual war waged across generations. From the moment Adam stepped out of the garden, the world didn't merely lose its beauty. It became a battlefield, a ceaseless war between the lineage preserved for the covenant and the bloodline mutated by the hands of fallen angels. Jubilees reveals, when the Watchers fell, they didn't merely break laws, they corrupted the structure of mankind. By uniting with human women, they created the Nephilim, beings half human, half divine, physically mighty, but spiritually hollow. This lineage continued through the ages under many names: Rephaim, Anakim, Zamzumim, Emim. They didn't just claim land, they seized the spiritual inheritance of humanity, pulling people further from God. And that current never stopped. From Jared, the father of Enoch, to Noah, to Abraham, to Joshua, to David, each generation had to battle the descendants of the fall. A war not only with swords, but with perseverance to keep the covenant in a world increasingly out of rhythm. Eden did not end in regret. It opened a continuous chain of battles, culminating in spiritual wars we mistook for military ones. David facing Goliath, Joshua conquering Hebron, Israel confronting fortified strongholds. All were slices in a timeline already set, revealed by God to Enoch and recorded by Moses so future generations wouldn't forget. If Eden was where the covenant was broken, Sinai was where it was renewed, not between generations, but between bloodlines, one that upheld the law and one that rebelled, one that preserved the light and one that passed on distortion. And the Book of Jubilees is the map helping us see this entire battleground from the first garden to the final conflict. Not in Adam's time, not right after mankind was cast out of Eden, but in the days of Jared, great-grandfather of Enoch, a gate truly opened. Not a physical gate, but a sacred boundary between two orders, the heavenly and the earthly. And for the first time, angels crossed that line, not in obedience, but in rebellion. According to Jubilees chapter 4, at the exact 10th Jubilee cycle, 490 years after the creation of man, God sent a group of angels called the Watchers to earth to teach the children of men and keep them from falling. But when they arrived, the opposite happened. The angels themselves were swept into a vortex of desire. They saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they made an oath together on Mount Hermon that they would all transgress, so none would turn back alone. Their leader was Samjaza, the most powerful among them. But before taking action, he hesitated. "I fear I will be the only one who falls, and you will abandon me." The others answered with a vow, "We will not turn back. We bind ourselves with a mutual curse." and so they rebelled in unison. The moment their feet touched the ground, time cracked. For this was not merely the first fall of angels, it was the first rupture between the sacred rhythm and human history. Jubilees implies that from the moment the Watchers broke their ordained place, the entire creation shifted out of the holy calendar. The solar calendar mingled with the lunar. The holy seasons were thrown into disorder. The rhythm of the covenant descended into chaos. The fall of the Watchers didn't just lead to Nephilim, it opened a systemic fall of species, culture, knowledge, and worship. They taught mankind sorcery, metallurgy, warfare, seduction, witchcraft, things not meant for humans at that time. Jared, whose name means descent, was no accident. It was the era when heaven and earth touched, not to unite, but to fracture. And from that fracture, a new bloodline was born, not of the covenant, not in sync with the sacred calendar, not carriers of light, but strong, proud, and bloodthirsty. A new cycle began, but this time not ordained by God. It was opened jointly by man and angel. A cycle of distortion stretching on until God closes it with fire and water. Among those who walked the earth before the flood, no one bore a more mysterious silence than Enoch. Scripture only says, Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, for God took him. But the Book of Jubilees pulls back that veil and reveals that Enoch was not merely a righteous man. He was the first to be taken to heaven and shown all of history, from the beginning to the end. Enoch didn't just see the future, God gave him a scroll, called the Book of Sacred History, containing all the Jubilee cycles, the preordained events, the seasons of feasts, the moments of judgment, and the covenants made or broken. It was not a book of man, but of angels, where every event in history was arranged in sacred order, unchangeable by any hand. Jubilees recounts that Enoch was tasked with writing everything he saw, not to keep for himself, but to pass on to his descendants, especially Noah, who would survive the great flood. God commanded him, "Write it down, so that on the day of judgment no one can say they were not warned." So what did Enoch become? Not a lonely prophet, but the keeper of heaven's archive. A living chronicle, a bridge between angel and man, between Eden and the end. In his day, when the Watchers were corrupting mankind with false knowledge, Enoch received another kind of knowledge, not to dominate, but to preserve the truth. And then he vanished, not dead, not buried, simply no more. For he had fulfilled his mission, leaving mankind with a map of time, a warning, and a promise that everything would come to pass at the appointed time. We often think of Enoch as a man ahead of his time, but the truth is, he stepped inside of time, saw the very spine of history, and returned to write it down for us. If we forget Enoch, we are not simply forgetting a figure. We are forgetting how God operates through time, judgment, and covenant. And that is the greatest loss of all. People remember Noah for the ark, for the rain, for the animals entering 2 by 2. But the Book of Jubilees highlights something else. Noah was not merely a survivor. He was the keeper of the covenant rhythm, in a world where that rhythm had nearly gone silent. After receiving the revelation passed down from Enoch, Noah did not merely know about the flood. He knew the timing. He knew the rituals. He He knew which days required sacrifice. He knew what to do and when to do it, not just to save himself, but to restore an order that had gone astray. Jubilees chapter 6 records that when the waters receded and the ark came to rest on the mountain, Noah's first act was not to examine the land or build a house, but to erect an altar and offer sacrifices on the exact day, in the exact way, according to the angelic instructions. And God smelled the pleasing aroma, a profound phrase echoing Eden when all things were still in divine order. Noah did not act out of emotion. He did not move from fear. He acted as a trained priest, one who had been taught, or who remembered, the sacred days, the proper sacrifices, the appointed seasons for renewing the covenant. In a world just wiped clean by the distortions of the Nephilim, the fall of the Watchers, and mankind's own destruction, Noah did not simply start over. He reconnected the lifeblood of a broken covenant, and he did so not on a day of his choosing, but on the day God had set in the sacred calendar. And in that very moment, God gave a promise. Never again will I destroy the earth like this. Then he established a sign, a rainbow in the sky, not merely a symbol of hope, but a mark that a new rhythm had begun. If Enoch was the one who saw the entire sacred timeline, Noah was the one who lived faithfully within it. He did not stop at survival. He lived rightly, preserving what future generations would depend on. A covenant not forgotten, even in a world that had once been washed clean. Noah didn't just save the species, he preserved the memory of God on earth. And Jubilees shows us that this was even more vital than escaping the flood. The waters had receded. The great wooden ark had settled upon the mountain. The skies were clear again. The land reopened, and a new beginning seemed established. But Jubilees says otherwise. The great flood did not erase everything. It only interrupted the stream. It did not destroy all consequences, for in the remaining shadows there were things that did not bear flesh, but still lived, still watched, still waited. Chapter 10 of Jubilees reveals a terrifying truth. The spirits of the Nephilim, the offspring of the fallen angels and human women, did not fully die. Their bodies were destroyed, but their souls, being not purely human, did not vanish. They became false gods, wicked spirits, deceptive entities, later known in Scripture as demons, idols, and gods of the nations. Noah, after surviving the flood, soon realized that evil was still creeping into the new world. And he prayed. He pleaded with God to bind all the remaining evil spirits. God agreed. But then a being appeared. Mastema, the chief of wickedness, came and petitioned him. He said, "O Lord, leave at least 1/10 of them, so that mankind may be tested to see whether they remain faithful." And God permitted it. 1/10 of the Nephilim spirits were allowed to remain, not because God was weak, but for the sake of the covenant, that mankind might be refined, chosen in freedom, and able to discern between light and darkness. What was the result? From the midst of the new lands, strange peoples began to appear. The Rephaim, Emim, Anakim, Zamzumim. Peoples of towering stature, deeper voices, extraordinary strength, but with different souls, cold, irreverent, and carrying in their blood remnants of a rebellion between heaven and earth. This is why, even after entering the Promised Land, the Israelites still faced fortified strongholds and giant tribes. Because the Nephilim, physically, had returned, not because God broke his promise, but because he had warned, what is not utterly destroyed by light will return in shadow. And the most frightening part is not their return, but that most of humanity no longer knew their true origin. When you forget the remnants of a holy war, you begin calling them by new names: heroes, kings, guardian spirits, or what you worship. But Jubilees does not forget. It records, because sacred history leaves no trace unwritten. Only mankind forgets. When the Israelites approached the borders of the Promised Land, they were not merely stepping into new territory. They were entering a battlefield preordained for generations. A war not just between tribes, but between two bloodlines, one bearing the covenant and the other the remnants of the Nephilim, beings once purged by water but still lingering in human flesh. The Book of Jubilees does not present these battles as ordinary warfare. It clearly states, Hebron, Bashan, and the strongholds of the Anakim were lands defiled by ancient rebellion, places where descendants of the hybrid race had settled and ruled. These cities were not just built high, they were built upon the forgetting of the covenant. The people there were not just strong, they were alien to the sacred law. And Joshua's mission was not merely to wield the sword, but to tear down structures misaligned with the holy calendar, to restore divine order. In Jubilees, the moment Israel crossed the Jordan, encircled Jericho, and advanced to Hebron, it was no accident. It was the appointed Jubilee, set since the days of Enoch, when God had established a time of action to protect the covenant. Thus, the command was not, take the land, but purge the land of darkness. At Hebron, Joshua defeated the 3 sons of Anak, the giants who once struck fear into Israel's spies. But now, under the hand of God's anointed, they were destroyed. And Bashan, the territory once ruled by the giant King Og, with his iron bed 9 cubits long, also fell. Each region marked as a dwelling place of the Watcher's offspring was now cut away like a festering wound from a sacred body. And strangely, when Joshua completed these battles, he did not crown himself king. He did not hoard the spoils. Instead, he built altars, redistributed the land by tribe, reinstated the Passover laws, and recorded the feast days, all signs of one living according to the sacred calendar, just as Moses had passed down from the revelation of God. That is why Joshua was not merely a warrior, but a tool in the hand of God, used to erase the consequences of the fall, not by water like in Noah's day, but through obedience and the sacred sword. And like Noah, he lived not by human time, but by the calendar of the covenant, where every battle had been preordained, and every victory was a sign that the light was still being restored. The story of David and Goliath has become a global symbol. A shepherd boy, without armor, without sword, armed only with a stone, defeating a prideful giant warrior. But the Book of Jubilees, by quietly aligning David with the flow of sacred time, helps us see this battle in a different light. David didn't just strike the right place, he struck at the right time. Goliath was not just a massive soldier, he was a descendant of the Rephaim, a surviving branch of the Nephilim, carrying a hazy memory of lost greatness. a race that once drowned the world in violence before the flood. And during the days when Israel trembled before him, the camp froze under the weight of inherited fear, that ancient dread of those who were taller, stronger, and seemingly undefeatable. Yet, at that exact time, at the close of a sacred cycle, David appeared, not in strength, but in his destined role, a young man never in battle, but who knew who the true God was. David's boldness didn't come from youth, but from an inner clock aligned with the rhythm of the covenant. When he said, "You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord," it wasn't just a declaration of faith, it was a declaration of divine timing. Jubilees does not name David, but the structure it lays out, of sacred cycles, of covenant keepers rising just as darkness grows, makes David the perfect fulfillment. He didn't defeat Goliath by strategy, but by walking the schedule God had set long before. After the victory, David did not immediately claim the throne. He quietly returned to his sheep. But a cycle had closed, not just because Goliath had fallen, but because the last known descendant of the Nephilim had been brought down by the faith of a humble man, a man unshaken by the ghosts of the past, aligned with the sacred calendar, and so became a symbol for a restored generation. David's victory was a spiritual triumph, for it marked the end of a chain of rebellion that began at Mount Hermon, passed through the lands of the Rephaim, and ended in the field where Goliath fell. And as Jubilees once hinted, each cycle ends with a chosen one, not because they are mighty, but because they are timely. David was that one. When Goliath fell, it was not the end, it was the beginning of the end. The last sons of the Rephaim, the final remnants of the ancient rebellion, were still scattered across battle lines, hiding in lands forgotten by memory. But Jubilees, with a gaze that pierces time, reveals every cycle of rebellion must close, on schedule, not a moment late. After Goliath, strange figures entered the battlefield, one by one. Ishbi-Benob, wielding a spear weighing hundreds of shekels, nearly killed David in his exhaustion. But Abishai, not a giant but a faithful man, struck him down. Then Lami, brother of Goliath, whose weapons were so massive that only seasoned warriors could lift them, was slain by Elhanan, son of Jare-Oregim. And finally, an unnamed figure, grotesque, with 6 fingers on each hand and foot, was brought down by Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, David's brother. Why does Scripture remember these names with such detail? Because those names weren't merely men. They were echoes of a race that once threatened the very structure of creation. And their end didn't come because Israel was stronger. It came because the cycle had reached its close. No new Goliath arose. No giant king had the strength to rebuild the empire of the Rephaim. Each name, each victory, rang like the final chimes of a dissonant melody that had stretched on since the days of Jared. The Book of Jubilees doesn't recount those battles specifically, but the theological foundation it lays, about appointed times, about judgment arriving exactly on schedule, about step-by-step cleansing, makes the fall of these final descendants not just the end of a war, but a sacred marker of history being restored to divine order. The covenant was not restored by strength. It was restored by faithfulness to the sacred calendar, by individuals like David, Abishai, Elhanan, Jonathan, each rising at the appointed time in the appointed role to close a chapter once thrown into chaos by the fall of angels. And after that, there is no more mention of giants. That silence is not a lack of detail. It is evidence that the genetic shadow, the ancient darkness, had been buried precisely when God decreed it. No more echoes, only the covenant and the light being rekindled. When the last of the Nephilim fell by the hands of the faithful, we might think the story was closed, that the light had won, that history had returned to its rhythm. But Jubilees does not say that. The book does not end in peace, but with a warning that the cycles would continue, that events would repeat, if mankind once again forgot the covenant. According to Jubilees, time does not move in a straight line. It turns in cycles. Each Jubilee, 49 years, is a sacred unit in which God measures the faithfulness of mankind. After a cleansing cycle comes a testing cycle. After restoration comes examination. Not because God changes, but because man always drifts back into shadow. And so the question is no longer in the book. It is here, now. Where are we in the cycle? Have we entered a new Jubilee? Do the global upheavals, the shifting seasons, the moral confusion, the return of the idea of deifying mankind serve as signs that a cycle of judgment is drawing near? Jubilees reveals that a time will come when seasons will fall out of alignment, feast days will be forgotten, the people will lose memory of the sacred days, and nations will worship what is not God. In that time, the sacred calendar will still mark the hours, but few will hear the bell ring. If, in the past, Enoch was taken up to see the Book of Time, if Noah was warned before the flood, if Joshua and David were placed at the right moment to cleanse the land, then in the coming cycle, who will stand in that role? You may think you're just a background character in a collapsing world, but God has never chosen the powerful or the prominent. He chooses those who live according to his timing, those who see the signs, those who do not walk by the world's clock, but by the calendar of the covenant. So if a new cycle is beginning, if the coming moment is the appointed time, then where are you standing on the sacred timeline? Do you hear the hidden movement of a history that has never stopped? Or do you still believe this is all just an ancient tale? Jubilees is not fantasy. It does not tell an alternate history, but makes clear what other books of the Bible only hint at. And perhaps that's exactly why it was hidden. Not because it was false, but because it was too clear. Clear enough that it could not be ignored. Clear enough to expose the precise moments when mankind and even angels broke the covenant. Clear enough that there would be no more excuses, no more gray areas to hide. Clear enough that you must choose, either live according to the sacred calendar or admit you've drifted far from it. Jubilees does not shy away. It does not romanticize history. It declares the fall of the Watchers was not myth, it was a real event occurring exactly in the 10th Jubilee cycle. It says the Nephilim were not just giants, but the result of spiritual distortion between heaven and earth. It states the law, the Sabbath, the covenant, the distinction between clean and unclean were known since the time of Adam, not invented in the days of Moses. And if so, then every act of disobedience after that bears a clear responsibility. Jubilees doesn't just tell stories, it records time. Each cycle, each turning point where humanity stepped away from light, and also each person who stood at the appointed hour to reconnect the rhythm of the covenant. Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David. Perhaps that's why it became inconvenient. Too inconvenient for religious systems wanting to blur the lines between law and grace. Too inconvenient for theology that sought to reduce history into mere symbols. And far too inconvenient for a world that prefers drifting through time rather than being summoned back to a calendar it long abandoned. But if you are reading or hearing about Jubilees today, perhaps it's not by accident. Perhaps you belong to a generation being awakened as heaven's clock begins to chime again, and perhaps you've been handed a scroll not to analyze, but to choose. Because once you know that everything happens by divine schedule, you can no longer live as though time is just something to pass. You must begin to live as if you are within a sacred page, just now turning. There are things mankind forgets, but heaven does not forget. There are stories we no longer tell, but the angels still guard them, still whisper them in the quiet moments of history. And the Book of Jubilees, though hidden from the faithful for centuries, still exists, not burned, not erased from the memory of heaven, because it is not just a text. It is a reminder that the angels still quietly defend. Michael, the archangel of justice, is described in Jubilees as interceding for humanity when the watchers fell. Raphael, the angel of healing, was tasked with binding Azazel and casting him into the darkness. Gabriel, the messenger, was sent to stir division among the Nephilim so they would destroy one another. Uriel, the bringer of light, was commanded to warn Noah before the great flood. They did not act once and vanish. According to the traditions of Jubilees, they remain, each guarding a part of the divine order that God placed within the Jubilee cycles. So what happens when mankind no longer tells these stories? When the 364-day calendar is forgotten? When sacred days are replaced by worldly holidays? When the covenant is merely a vague memory in the believer's mind? Nothing is lost. It's just that humanity no longer hears the sound. The angels still remember. And Jubilees is still preserved in the scrolls of Qumran, in ancient churches like those in Ethiopia, and in the sacred memory stirring within awakened souls. You may have never heard of the sacred calendar, of preordained cycles, of how each era has someone appointed to live in rhythm with the covenant. But that doesn't mean you're outside of that timeline. You are living within some rhythm. The question is it the right one? Maybe your life feels chaotic because you've been running by the rhythm of a world out of sync. And if that's true, then Jubilees is more than an ancient manuscript. It's a compass, realigning you to know what is the 9th hour, what is the 14th year, what cycle is about to bring judgment or restoration. The angels still remember. The book still exists. And you, if you can still hear this, may be the one chosen to make sure the sacred is not forgotten again. You don't need to be lifted to heaven like Enoch. You don't need to stand on the battlefield like David, but you too are living within a preordained cycle, and you still carry a piece of the covenant. No one demands you become a hero, but every faithful soul is a main character in sacred history, not because they are great, but because they live at the appointed time when God calls. Perhaps your era has no giants, no volcanoes or floods, but there are still things out of order, and still a need for someone, just one person, to keep the rhythm of the covenant in silence. What season are you living in? What cycle are you in? That's not measured by your birth year or the Gregorian calendar. It is measured by the faithfulness of your choices, your prayers, your commitment to live rightly in a misaligned world. You are not forgotten, you are appointed. And as long as you keep the flame, the covenant is not extinguished. Don't wait until everything collapses to realize the time has struck. Don't wait for the trumpet to sound from heaven to begin living as someone who belongs to the covenant. The cycle never ends in noise, it ends in silence, and those who are not awake won't even know they're off course. Jubilees is not for casual reading. It is a call to awaken. It shows that God always acts at the appointed time, but mankind often acts too late. From Jared to the Watchers, from Noah to the flood, from Abraham to Goliath. Each moment arrived when truth could no longer be delayed, and only those already prepared stood firm. And what about you? You may feel like just an ordinary person living in a chaotic era, unsure of what is right, what is real. But it is those who seemed insignificant, who were placed at the pivotal moments in every cycle of sacred history. Not because they were talented, but because they knew how to live in rhythm before the final hour came. Live as though a cycle is closing. Re-examine. Does your lifestyle still remember the sacred days? Does your calendar still make room for God? Do your decisions, relationships, and dreams reflect the rhythm of the covenant? You don't need to know the entire future, but you can begin to live rightly in the present, like Enoch, writing in silence, like Noah, building the ark before the rain, like David, standing when all others trembled. Sacred history has not ended. It is waiting for someone to continue it. And if you still hear the call from a forgotten book, if you still feel the turning of unseen cycles beneath the surface of this world, then perhaps you are the next chosen one, not in a myth, but in the living story, unfolding day by day. Don't wait. Begin. For when the door closes, the knocking will no longer be heard, but those who awoke beforehand will already be inside. Amen.